There is a place in the Canadian North where the ground holds a secret so dangerous that the government has committed to guarding it. Not for 10 years, not for 100 years, but forever. Not a figure of speech, not a political promise that will be quietly retired when the next administration takes office. Forever, as in the people responsible for this place have written into official documents that the monitoring and the maintenance and the containment must continue in perpetuity, because if it stops, if the money runs out, if the systems fail, if someone simply forgets, the consequences will be catastrophic enough to poison an entire city's water supply and render the surrounding land uninhabitable for generations. The place is called Giant Mine. It sits on the outskirts of Yellowknife in Canada's Northwest Territories, on the traditional land of the Yellowknives, Dean First Nation, and buried beneath it, locked inside sealed underground chambers carved out of the bedrock, sit 237,000 tons of arsenic trioxide dust. That number does not fully land the first time you hear it, so let me help you feel it. Arsenic trioxide is one of the most toxic substances on Earth. A dose the size of a match head is enough to kill an adult human being. 237,000 tons is enough to kill every person alive on Earth several times over. It is sitting in the ground right now, a few kilometers from a city of 20,000 people, kept frozen inside chambers that must be actively refrigerated around the clock, every hour of every day, because if the freezing systems ever fail, the arsenic will begin to migrate. It will move through the rock. It will reach the groundwater. It will reach Back Bay and Yellowknife Bay and eventually Great Slave Lake, one of the deepest freshwater lakes in the world. The arsenic did not come from nowhere. It came from gold. Specifically, it came from decades of gold. Mining operations that made a small number of people very wealthy while leaving behind a problem so enormous and so permanent that the Canadian government is spending over $1 billion trying to manage it, and the management plan they have settled on is not to remove the arsenic, not to neutralize it, not to make it safe. The plan is to keep it frozen, indefinitely, in the ground, beneath a neighborhood, and the workers who breathe that dust, the men who went underground every shift for years, and came home with burning lungs and trembling hands and strange neurological symptoms they could not explain. Many of them were told that what they were experiencing was not serious. Some of them were told they were fine. Some of them were told to keep quiet. This is the story of Giant Mine. It is a story about gold and greed and a poison buried in the permafrost. It is a story about the men who dug it up, the government that looked the other way, the Indigenous community whose land and water were put at risk without their consent, and a problem so massive and so permanent that every Canadian alive today will spend part of their tax dollars managing it, and so will their grandchildren, and so will their grandchildren's grandchildren. If you have never heard of Giant Mine, you are not alone. It is one of the most consequential environmental disasters in Canadian history, and most Canadians cannot tell you a single thing about it. That changes right now. Before we go underground, if this kind of deep dive into hidden history is what you came here for, this channel is where we do this every single week. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, and leave a comment right now telling me where in the world you are watching from. Every time I post people from countries I have never been to show up in those comments, and I genuinely love knowing who is on the other side of this. Hit subscribe. Now let us go back to the beginning. The story of Giant Mine begins, like most stories of extraction in the Canadian North, with someone from somewhere else deciding that what was in the ground belonged to them. The year is 1935. The Great Depression has hollowed out the economies of the industrialized world. In Canada, unemployment is catastrophic. Men are riding freight trains across the prairies looking for work that does not exist. The price of gold, however, is rising, because gold is what governments reach for when everything else is failing. And in the Northwest Territories, along the northern shore of Great Slave Lake, prospectors are pushing into country that most Canadians have never seen and could not find on a map. The Northwest Territories in 1935 is not a place with roads. It is not a place with reliable communication. It is a place of boreal forest and granite outcroppings and vast cold lakes and rivers that freeze solid enough to drive a truck across them in winter and become impassable in summer. The Yellowknives Dean have lived in this country for thousands of years. They know every river, every portage, every season. The prospectors who arrive in the 1930s know almost none of this and care about only one thing: the glint of metal in the rock. Gold was first confirmed near the site of present-day Yellowknife in 1934, when a prospector named Johnny Baker staked a claim after finding promising samples along the northern shore of Yellowknife Bay. Word spread the way it always does in a depression, which is fast and loud and distorted. Within a year, there were hundreds of men in the area, staking claims, arguing over survey lines, filing paperwork at the territorial office, and drinking in the handful of rough establishments that had appeared practically overnight in what would become the town of Yellowknife. The geology of the Yellowknife area is ancient in a way that is difficult for the human mind to fully grasp. The rock formations underlying the region are part of what geologists call the Canadian Shield, some of the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the Earth, 2.5 billion years in some places, formed when the planet was young, and the processes that would eventually produce complex life were billions of years away. Gold had been deposited in this ancient rock through hydrothermal processes, carried in superheated fluids that moved through fractures and faults in the crust and left behind veins of metal as they cooled. The veins near Yellowknife were rich. They were also, as the miners who would eventually work them came to discover, embedded in a particular type of rock that presented a problem nobody talked about very much in the promotional literature that began circulating in the late 1930s to attract investment capital to the region. The gold near Yellowknife was what miners call refractory ore. It was locked inside arsenopyrite, a mineral that contains iron, arsenic, and sulfur. Getting the gold out required processing the arsenopyrite in a way that released the arsenic. And arsenic, once released, does not go quietly back into the ground. The claim that would become Giant Mine was staked in 1935 by Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company, later known as Cominco. The name Giant came from the scale of the operation that was envisioned, and that ambition was not misplaced. Beneath the surface of that claim lay one of the richest gold deposits in Canadian history. The question of what to do with the arsenic that would come out along with the gold was a question that would be answered later, always with the least expensive solution available, always with more concern for the bottom line of the company than for the health of the workers or the safety of the land. Underground operations at Giant Mine began in earnest in the mid-1940s, after a period of wartime suspension. The federal government had diverted resources and attention elsewhere, but by 1945, the war was ending and the appetite for gold production had returned. Consolidated Mining ramped up operations, sinking shafts deeper into the rock, extending drifts and crosscuts through the ore body, pulling out rock that would be crushed and roasted and processed until the gold surrendered itself from the arsenopyrite matrix that had held it for 2.5 billion years. The process of liberating gold from arsenopyrite is called roasting. You crush the ore to a fine powder. You heat it in a roaster at extremely high temperatures. The arsenic in the arsenopyrite oxidizes and becomes arsenic trioxide, a white powder that looks not unlike flour and is among the deadliest substances humans have ever worked with. The gold, freed from its arsenic matrix, can then be recovered through further processing. The arsenic trioxide, meanwhile, has to go somewhere. In the early years of Giant Mine's operation, the arsenic trioxide went into the air. The roaster stacks released it in clouds that drifted over the surrounding landscape. It settled on the tundra. It settled on the ice of Yellowknife Bay. It settled on the caribou that the Yellowknives Dean depended on for food, and it settled on the berry patches where Diné women harvested food for their families, and it settled on the fish in the lakes. The company knew this. The government knew this. The decision that was made repeatedly over decades was that gold production was more important than the health of the people and the land downwind of the roaster stacks. This decision was not made in secret. It was made openly in boardrooms and government offices by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The language they used was the language of economic necessity, of northern development, of Canada's resource destiny. The people who bore the costs of that decision, the Diné communities, the workers, the families living in Yellowknife's less affluent neighborhoods, did not have seats in those boardrooms or offices. They were not consulted. Their health was weighed against corporate profit and found to be less important. This pattern, the sacrifice of the vulnerable in the service of extraction, is not unique to Giant Mine. It is the story of resource development across the Canadian North and across much of the world. But Giant Mine is, in certain specific ways, an extreme version of this story, because the arsenic it produced was not a manageable quantity that could be dispersed or diluted or buried and forgotten. It was an almost incomprehensible quantity that accumulated underground over decades, and now it sits in the ground in a quantity so enormous that the only plan anyone has been able to devise is to keep it frozen forever and hope that forever is long enough. The town of Yellowknife grew up around the mine. This is not a metaphor. The geography of modern Yellowknife, the placement of its streets, its neighborhoods, its commercial districts, its sense of itself as a city, was shaped by the presence of Giant Mine and the other gold mining operations that followed it. Men came north from every province in Canada, from Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and Ontario and Quebec, and from farther afield, from Britain and Finland and Italy and Ukraine, drawn by the promise of steady work in a place where steady work was paying wages that could not be found in the South. Mining in the 1940s and 1950s was dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully convey. The men who worked underground at Giant Mine faced hazards that were constant and varied, and often poorly understood even by the scientists and engineers whose job it was to manage them. Rockfalls, equipment failures, explosive misfires, carbon monoxide buildups. The ordinary risks of underground work, amplified by the particular conditions of a hard rock gold mine in the subarctic, where the rock was ancient and unpredictable, and the cold outside meant that the ventilation systems that might have mitigated some of the atmospheric hazards inside were sometimes insufficient. And then there was the arsenic. The men who worked in the roaster building and in the areas adjacent to roasting operations were exposed to arsenic, trioxide dust constantly. Not occasionally, not in acute incidents, but as a routine feature of their working day. In the early years of the mine's operation, there was no systematic effort to protect workers from this exposure. Respiratory protection was minimal. Ventilation in the roaster areas was inadequate. Workers went home at the end of their shifts with arsenic dust on their clothes, in their hair, in the creases of their hands. They carried it into their homes, where their wives and children were exposed to it. They washed it off in shared bathrooms. They sat down to dinner with their families, and the arsenic came with them. The health effects of chronic arsenic exposure are well documented now. They were less well documented in the 1940s, but they were not unknown. Arsenic had been recognized as a poison since antiquity. Napoleon Bonaparte, according to one persistent theory, was slowly poisoned by arsenic in the wallpaper paste of his damp exile on St. Helena. The connection between arsenic exposure and specific patterns of illness had been studied in industrial and occupational contexts in Europe since the 19th century. The men running Giant Mine were not working in ignorance of arsenic's toxicity. They were working in a system where that toxicity was understood and considered acceptable, because the men doing the breathing were not the men making the decisions. Workers at Giant Mine began reporting health problems in the 1940s and continued reporting them for as long as the mine operated. Skin lesions, peripheral neuropathy, a deadening and tingling in the hands and feet that could progress to serious disability. Cancers, especially cancers of the lung and the liver and the bladder. Neurological symptoms, difficulty concentrating, memory problems, what workers and their families sometimes describe simply as not being themselves anymore. The connection between these symptoms and the arsenic dust they were breathing every day was not, in most cases, formally acknowledged by the company or by the government health authorities that were supposed to be monitoring the situation. This is the part of the story that tends to produce a specific kind of discomfort in people who encounter it for the first time, because the evidence of harm was not hidden from the people responsible. It was reported to them. Workers went to the company doctor and described their symptoms. Union representatives raised concerns. The records of these exchanges survive in archives, and they are deeply uncomfortable to read, because the pattern that emerges from them is not the pattern of people who did not know. It is the pattern of people who knew and chose, again and again, to minimize, to delay, to reassure, to tell the men with burning lungs and trembling hands that they were fine, that the levels of arsenic were within acceptable limits, that there was nothing to worry about. The phrase acceptable limits does a great deal of work in the history of industrial exposure to toxic substances. It sounds scientific. It sounds like someone has done the research and established the threshold at which harm begins and calibrated the workplace environment to stay safely below it. What it actually means, in most historical contexts, is that someone has weighed the cost of protecting workers against the cost of production and arrived at a number that prioritizes the latter. The acceptable limits for arsenic exposure at Giant Mine in the 1940s and 1950s were set by people whose primary concern was not the long-term health of the men breathing the dust. This is demonstrable from the records, not an inference or an accusation. There was a labor movement at Giant Mine, and it was active and sometimes militant, and it understood the arsenic problem better than the company wanted to acknowledge. In 1992, a labor dispute at the mine escalated into one of the most tragic events in Canadian labor history. The strike by the Canadian Association of Smelter and Allied Workers had been going on for months when on September 18th, a bomb exploded underground in a mine tunnel, killing 9 replacement workers who had been brought in to keep the mine running during the strike. A striking miner named Roger Warren was eventually convicted of placing the bomb. The explosion and its aftermath, the deaths, the trial, the fracturing of the Yellowknife community, became the defining event in the popular memory of Giant Mine, the thing people mention when they mention Giant Mine at all. But the 9 men who died in that explosion were not the only men who died because of Giant Mine. They were the ones whose deaths were sudden and visible and prosecutable. The men who died slowly, over years, from the cancers and the neurological damage that arsenic exposure produces are harder to count, harder to see, and their deaths are more difficult to attribute with the kind of legal certainty that leads to prosecution. They died in hospital beds and in their homes, sometimes decades after their exposure, and the official records of Giant Mine do not contain a tally of them. The mine operated for decades, changing ownership, changing names, cycling through the boom and bust rhythms of gold prices and operating costs that characterize the mining industry. Consolidated Mining and Smelting gave way to Giant Yellowknife Mines Limited. Giant Yellowknife Mines became Miramar Mining. The company changed, but the roaster kept roasting, and the arsenic trioxide kept accumulating. In the early years, some of the arsenic trioxide that came out of the roaster was sold as a commercial product. Arsenic trioxide has industrial applications. It was used in pesticides, in the production of glass, in various chemical manufacturing processes. For a time, the mine was actually making money from its arsenic output, which provided some justification for framing the roasting process not as a waste problem, but as a value-added operation. But the commercial market for arsenic trioxide was not unlimited, and as the mine produced more and more of it over the decades, the question of where to put the material that could not be sold became increasingly urgent. The answer that was arrived at, incrementally, and without anything that could be described as a comprehensive plan, was to store it underground. The natural cavities left behind by ore extraction provided ready-made storage chambers. The mine had been pulling rock out of the ground for decades, leaving behind a network of voids in the bedrock. The arsenic trioxide could be piped into these voids, where it would settle as a fine powder coating the walls and floors of the abandoned chambers. This seemed to the people making the decision like a reasonable solution. The arsenic would be underground. It would be out of sight. The problem would be managed. What was not fully accounted for in this reasoning was the behavior of arsenic trioxide in the presence of water. Arsenic trioxide is highly soluble. Put it in contact with water and it dissolves readily, forming arsenious acid, which is mobile and toxic, and will move through rock and soil until it finds its way into a water source. The underground chambers at Giant Mine were not perfectly sealed from groundwater. Water moved through the rock in ways that were not fully mapped or understood, and beneath the permafrost that overlaid the rock, the hydrology was complex in ways that the engineers of the 1950s and 1960s did not have the tools to fully characterize. By the time the mine's owners began to seriously reckon with the scale of the arsenic storage problem, the quantity underground had grown to a number that defied easy comprehension. 237,000 tons. It had been accumulating for decades, chamber by chamber, year by year, each individual decision to pipe another batch underground seeming like a practical and manageable choice. The individual decisions adding up to a cumulative catastrophe that no single person had planned or authorized or even fully understood while it was happening. This is one of the ways that environmental disasters of this scale typically unfold, not as a single dramatic decision by a villain who fully understands what they are doing and chooses to do it anyway, but as the accumulated result of thousands of small decisions, each defensible in isolation, each made by people who were responding to the immediate pressures of their situation. The bottom line, the quarterly report, the regulatory environment that asked limited questions and required limited answers. The people who piped arsenic into underground chambers at Giant Mine in 1957 were not thinking about 2024. They were thinking about 1957. By the 1990s, it was becoming undeniable that the arsenic problem at Giant Mine was not going to be solved by incremental management. The quantity underground was too large. The potential for it to contaminate Yellowknife's water supply was real and documented. The permafrost that had been keeping the arsenic powder relatively stable was beginning to be affected by rising temperatures in the subarctic, which are climbing faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. The mine's operators were running out of road, financially, and practically, when Miramar Mining, the company then operating Giant Mine, went bankrupt and walked away from the property in the early 2000s. The arsenic problem was left on the doorstep of the federal government. This is a pattern familiar from mining history around the world. The profits are privatized and the cleanup costs are socialized. The company extracts the value and leaves. The public pays for what remains. What remained at Giant Mine was the largest known deposit of arsenic trioxide in the world, sitting in the ground beneath a small northern city, with no private entity willing or able to take financial responsibility for it. The federal government's response to inheriting this problem was not swift. Nothing about the federal government's response to Giant Mine has been swift. The history of the government's engagement with the arsenic problem is a history of studies commissioned and delayed, of consultation processes announced and extended, of budgets allocated and revised upward, of timelines set and missed. What has not happened at any point in this history is the government finding a solution that actually makes the arsenic safe or removes it from the ground. The remediation plan that was eventually adopted, after years of study and consultation, centers on freezing. The arsenic trioxide is to be kept permanently frozen inside its underground chambers by an active refrigeration system. Thermosiphons, devices that use the temperature differential between the cold Arctic air and the warmer ground to pump heat out of the earth, have been installed across the site. An active refrigeration plant has been built to supplement the thermosiphons during summer months when passive cooling is insufficient. The goal is to maintain the arsenic in a frozen state in which it cannot dissolve into groundwater and migrate to Yellowknife's water supply. The technical term for this approach is frozen block containment, and the people who developed it are serious engineers who have done serious work on a genuinely difficult problem. The physics of the approach are sound under the conditions they were designed for. The arsenic, kept frozen, stays put. The cavities in the bedrock do not leak frozen powder the way they might leak a liquid. The system, if maintained, and if the temperature conditions it was designed for persist, should work. The qualifications in that sentence are doing important work, if maintained, if the temperature conditions persist. The thermosiphon and refrigeration system at Giant Mine requires ongoing operation. It requires electricity. It requires staffing. It requires monitoring. It requires maintenance of the infrastructure, the pipes and the compressors and the monitoring wells and the systems that allow engineers to track the temperature of the frozen block and detect any changes that might indicate the containment is failing. The cost of this ongoing operation is substantial, estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars over the coming decades, with no clear endpoint because the arsenic does not become safe with time. It remains arsenic trioxide, as toxic as it was on the day it was roasted out of the ore, indefinitely into the future. The remediation project is officially described as being managed in perpetuity. Perpetuity, not for a defined term that a government can budget for and a public can evaluate. Forever, the federal government has, in effect, assumed permanent responsibility for maintaining a frozen block of arsenic trioxide beneath a northern city, and the cost of that permanent responsibility will be borne by Canadian taxpayers and by the taxpayers who come after them and by the taxpayers who come after them. The question of what happens if the system fails is not a hypothetical that engineers and government officials enjoy discussing, but it is a question that has been studied because responsible management of a risk this significant requires understanding what the consequences of failure would be. The studies are not comforting. If the frozen block thaws, the arsenic trioxide dissolves into groundwater. The groundwater in the Yellowknife area connects to Back Bay and Yellowknife Bay and ultimately to Great Slave Lake. The contamination would be mobile and difficult to contain once it began moving. The remediation options for contaminated groundwater of this kind are extremely limited and extremely expensive. The word catastrophic appears in the technical literature. There is also the question of climate change. The subarctic is warming. The permafrost that underlay the giant mine site and provided some natural assistance to the freezing effort is thawing in ways that are not fully predictable and that complicate the engineering models the containment system was designed around. The refrigeration load required to keep the arsenic frozen increases as ambient temperatures rise. The thermosiphons that provide passive cooling work less efficiently as winters become less cold and less long. The system was designed for specific climatic conditions, and those conditions are changing. Nobody who manages the giant mine remediation project will tell you that they have solved the problem. What they will tell you is that they are managing it, that the current approach is the best available option given the constraints, that the monitoring is ongoing and the systems are functioning. What they cannot tell you is that the arsenic will never be a danger to Yellowknife's water supply, because the honest answer to that question depends on conditions extending hundreds or thousands of years into the future, and no one can guarantee those conditions. The people who were most directly put at risk by the arsenic problem at Giant Mine, and who had the least say in how that risk was created and managed, are the Yellowknives Dean First Nation, whose traditional territory encompasses the land on which the mine was built and the waters into which its contamination flows. The Yellowknives Dean have lived on the shores of Great Slave Lake and along the waterways of the surrounding region since time before the historical record begins. Their relationship with this land is not a matter of sentiment or abstract cultural attachment. It is a material relationship built on millennia of subsistence practice, on the harvesting of fish and caribou and berries and medicine plants that the land provides, on an intimate knowledge of the seasonal patterns and ecological relationships of a specific place that is not interchangeable with any other place. When Giant Mine began operating in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the Yellowknives Dean were not consulted about whether a gold mine should be built on their traditional territory. The legal framework that governed land use in the Northwest Territories at the time did not require their consent and did not particularly encourage their input. The mine was built. The roasters began burning. The arsenic trioxide began drifting out of the stacks and settling on the land. The effects on the Yellowknives Dean were immediate and severe and were not immediately understood as connected to the mine, partly because the connection between arsenic exposure and specific health outcomes was not common knowledge in Indigenous communities in the 1940s, and partly because the company and government were not forthcoming with information that might have helped the community understand what was happening to them. Berries collected near the mine site were laced with arsenic. Fish from Yellowknife Bay carried arsenic in their tissue. Caribou that grazed on vegetation near the mine accumulated arsenic in their bodies. The traditional food system of the Yellowknives Dean was contaminated, and the contamination was invisible and tasteless and gave no warning of its presence. People ate what they had always eaten, from the land they had always harvested, and the arsenic went with the food. The health impacts in the Yellowknives Dean community followed patterns consistent with chronic arsenic exposure. Elevated rates of certain cancers, unusual skin conditions, neurological symptoms. The documentation of these impacts in the community is incomplete, partly because the community was not provided with the information necessary to understand and record what was happening, and partly because the healthcare system that served the Northwest Territories in the mid-20th century was not oriented toward investigating or acknowledging the health effects of industrial contamination on Indigenous communities. The Yellowknives Dean have been engaged in the remediation process at Giant Mine, but engagement in a process designed and managed by others is a different thing from having had a genuine role in the decisions that created the situation requiring remediation. The community has consistently raised concerns about the frozen block approach, about the long-term reliability of the containment system, about the implications of the mine's presence for their ability to continue living from the land and water of their territory. These concerns are documented in the consultation records of the remediation process. The remediation plan that has been adopted is the plan the federal government concluded was the best available option, and the Yellowknives Dean live with the consequences of that conclusion. The question of what the Yellowknives Dean are owed for the decades of damage their community sustained, for the contamination of their food system, for the health impacts they experienced, for the violation of their right to determine what happens on their traditional territory, is a question that has not been fully answered by the remediation process or by any other federal initiative. Compensation has been discussed. Formal apologies have been offered. The arsenic is still in the ground. There is a concept in environmental justice that researchers and advocates sometimes describe as the geography of sacrifice. It refers to the pattern, observable across the industrialized world, in which the communities that bear the greatest costs of industrial production are consistently the communities with the least political and economic power to refuse that imposition. The geography of sacrifice runs through the history of resource extraction in Canada with extraordinary consistency. The giant mine arsenic problem is not an anomaly in this history. It is one of its clearest illustrations. The workers who went underground at Giant Mine and who worked in the roasting facilities and who processed the ore and who breathed the dust are a population that does not appear prominently in most accounts of the mine. The 9 men who died in the 1982 explosion are named and mourned. The executives who managed the mine and the politicians who oversaw its regulatory environment are part of the documented record of decisions and non-decisions. The ordinary miners, the men who showed up for their shifts and did the work, are often present in the history only as a collective noun. They came from everywhere, from Newfoundland fishing communities where the cod had run out and the men needed work, from coal mining towns in Cape Breton where the pits were closing, from Finland and Norway, miners from traditions of underground work that went back generations, men who knew hard rock and respected it in the way that men who have seen it kill their colleagues tend to. From southern Europe, from Italy and Greece and Portugal, men who had crossed the ocean looking for the prosperity Canada had promised and found themselves, eventually, in the subarctic, doing work that was physically brutal and chemically dangerous, and paid a wage that was better than what they could find elsewhere. They were not unintelligent or incurious about the conditions of their work. The union at Giant Mine was active, and the men who were most engaged in it understood that the arsenic was a problem. There are accounts from former miners describing the visible signs of arsenic exposure, the white coating that would settle on surfaces in the roaster building, the taste of it in the air, the way it would collect on the mucous membranes and produce a characteristic burning sensation, the way men who worked in the roaster area for years would develop skin conditions that were not like the ordinary rashes and abrasions of industrial work. The company's response to these concerns varied over the decades of the mine's operation, but a consistent thread runs through the accounts of workers who raised health concerns. Minimization. The levels you are being exposed to are within acceptable limits. The symptoms you are describing are not consistent with arsenic exposure. The studies we have done show that the situation is being managed appropriately. These reassurances were given to men who were sick and who suspected correctly that the sickness was connected to their work. Some of them kept working because the wage was real and the reassurances were official and there was nothing certain enough to justify leaving a job in a town where the mine was the economy. Some of them died. The specific number is not known with certainty, because establishing a definitive causal connection between industrial arsenic exposure and death from cancer or organ failure decades after the exposure is methodologically difficult and legally fraught. Companies and their insurers and the government agencies that are supposed to hold them accountable tend to exploit this methodological difficulty, and the exploitation has a long history at Giant Mine as at other sites of industrial toxic exposure. What is known is that the rate of certain cancers in the population of former Giant Mine workers is elevated above what would be expected in a comparable population without occupational arsenic exposure. Studies of former workers have found elevated rates of lung cancer, of bladder cancer, of cancers of the kidney and the liver. The elevated rates are consistent with what the scientific literature predicts for populations with the level of arsenic exposure that mine records suggest these men experienced. Proving causation in any individual case is difficult. The pattern across the population is clear. The workers who raised concerns about arsenic exposure in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s were not, in most cases, formally told to keep quiet in the sense of being given an explicit instruction to say nothing. The silencing was subtler than that and more effective for its subtlety. It worked through the reassurances given by company doctors. It worked through the implicit understanding that a man who made too much trouble about his health could find himself without a shift. It worked through the culture of hard rock mining, which valued stoicism and physical toughness and did not have much room for a man who worried about dust. It worked through the absence of information, the fact that the men who were breathing the arsenic were not given access to the studies that were being done on their behalf, were not told the results of the air quality monitoring that was being conducted, were not given a clear picture of what the science said about the health effects they were experiencing. This is not, to be absolutely clear, ancient history. The mine operated until 2004. There are men alive today who worked at Giant Mine and who breathe arsenic trioxide dust and who are living with the health consequences of that exposure. They are old men now, many of them, and some of them are dying of cancers that are consistent with their occupational history. The silencing that kept them from fully understanding their situation did not end when the mine closed. It ended, if it ended, when researchers and journalists and advocates began the work of documenting what had happened and making it available to the people it affected. The story of Giant Mine is not unique in the history of Canadian resource extraction, and understanding it in isolation misses something important about how this kind of harm becomes possible and persists for as long as it does. There is a broader landscape of mining contamination in Canada, a geography of abandoned pits and tailings ponds and sealed chambers and contaminated water tables that stretches from British Columbia to the Northwest Territories to Newfoundland. And the story at each of these sites rhymes with the story at Giant Mine, even when the specific mineral and the specific community and the specific decade are different. Port Radium is one of the rhymes. Located on the eastern shore of Great Bear Lake in the Northwest Territories, the Port Radium mine extracted uranium ore beginning in the 1930s, in the period when uranium's applications for weapons production were becoming clear to the governments that were racing to develop them. The mine supplied uranium to the Manhattan Project, the American program that produced the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The Sahtudin, the indigenous people of the Great Bear Lake region, worked at Port Radium. They were employed as laborers, and specifically as the men who carried the uranium ore from the mine to the barges that would transport it downriver. They carried the ore in burlap sacks on their backs. The sacks were not lined with anything protective because the people who designed the labor system at Port Radium in the 1930s and 1940s were not concerned enough with the health of Indigenous workers to add that expense. The Dean Porters carried radioactive ore against their bodies, breathed uranium dust, lived in an environment saturated with the material. The Satu Den called the men who worked this job the hired hands of death, not because they knew at the time what uranium was, or what it was being used for, or what radiation does to living tissue. They called them this because the men who carried the ore were sick, and their sickness was different from ordinary sickness, and the community came to understand that the sickness came from the work. The rate of cancer in the DNA communities associated with Port Radium was dramatically elevated above expected rates. The government knew this, or had access to information that should have led to this conclusion far earlier than it acted on it. The story of what was known and when and what was done about it follows a pattern that will be familiar from the giant mine account. Studies, reassurances, minimization, delay, and eventual acknowledgement that came too late for many of the people who were harmed. Canada has something in the vicinity of 10,000 abandoned mine sites across the country, ranging from small operations that left behind modest quantities of contaminated tailings to large industrial operations that left behind landscapes of toxic waste. The government estimates the liability associated with cleaning up these sites in the billions of dollars. The actual cost is almost certainly higher than the official estimate, because the history of estimating environmental cleanup costs in the mining industry is a history of consistent underestimation. The pattern that produced Giant Mine and Port Radium and the other contaminated sites across the Canadian North is a pattern rooted in specific choices about how to organize a society and whose interests to prioritize. The choice to allow mining companies to operate in ways that created long-term liabilities they would not bear, to allow them to externalize the cost of their waste onto the public and onto Indigenous communities, to protect the profitability of extraction at the expense of the health of workers and the integrity of the land. These were not natural or inevitable choices. They were made by specific people in specific institutions, and they could have been made differently. They still can be. There is a federal initiative called the Giant Mine Remediation Project, managed by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada in partnership with the government of the Northwest Territories and the Yellowknives Dean First Nation. It has a website. It publishes annual reports. It holds public meetings in Yellowknife, where engineers present technical briefings on the progress of the freezing system, and community members ask questions that are answered with varying degrees of candor. The project's budget has been revised upward multiple times from the initial estimates. The current cost estimate for the full remediation project runs to over 1 billion Canadian dollars, and this estimate has been challenged by independent analysts who believe it understates the long-term costs of permanent monitoring and maintenance. $1 billion is the largest cost ever attached to a mine cleanup in Canadian history. It is borne entirely by the public. The remediation work visible on the surface at Giant Mine involves the dismantling of the above-ground infrastructure that is no longer needed, the processing and containment of contaminated soil across the mine site, the construction of covers over tailings areas to reduce contact between rainwater and the contaminated material, and the installation and maintenance of the thermosiphon and refrigeration systems that are keeping the arsenic underground frozen. There are monitoring wells spread across the property and in the surrounding area, instruments measuring ground temperature and water quality and movement of the frozen block, generating data that is reviewed by engineers trying to determine whether the containment is behaving as expected. What you cannot see at Giant Mine, what you will not see on any visit to the surface, is the arsenic itself, It is underground in chambers that have been sealed. The sealing is not metaphorical. The entrances to the chambers where arsenic is stored have been closed, the areas around them stabilized, the shafts and adits through which it might be accessed blocked. The arsenic is underground and it will remain underground. The workers who worked near those chambers in the years when the arsenic was being piped into them were sometimes given the impression that the material being stored was not a long-term concern, that it was being managed appropriately, that the storage was a temporary solution pending a better one. The better solution has not arrived. The arsenic is still there. Some of the men who piped it into those chambers have died. The chambers remain sealed and the arsenic remains inside them, and the freezing systems run day and night to ensure that it stays that way. The official language around Giant Mine tends to be careful and technical and reassuring. The remediation project's communications emphasize the progress that is being made, the systems that are functioning, the monitoring that is ongoing. This is appropriate in the sense that the people managing the project are doing serious and difficult work and deserve credit for the genuine effort being made. It does not change the underlying situation, which is that there is a permanent, multi-generational liability buried under a northern city, and the plan for managing it is to keep it frozen and hope that the systems hold, and the climate does not warm too quickly, and the budgets do not get cut, and the institutional memory necessary to maintain a 100-year containment project does not get lost. Institutional memory is not a small concern. The Giant Mine Remediation Project will outlive every person currently working on it. It will outlive their successors. It will require consistent, well-funded, technically competent management. For longer than any institution in human history has maintained consistent, well-funded, technically competent management of any single thing. The Roman Empire lasted roughly 500 years. The Catholic Church is among the oldest continuous institutions in the Western world at roughly 2,000 years. The frozen arsenic at Giant Mine will not become safe in 2,000 years. It will not become safe in any human time frame. It will simply remain arsenic trioxide in the dark beneath the permafrost for as long as the rock holds and the systems run and someone is paying attention. The people of Yellowknife live with this fact, mostly without thinking about it, in the way that people tend to live with risks that are invisible and underground, and managed by official institutions they have some reason to trust and some reason to doubt. The monitoring results are published. The water quality in Yellowknife Bay is tested regularly. The numbers at the moment are within acceptable limits. You will notice that phrase appearing again. There is a generation of Yellowknife residents who grew up playing near the mine site, who swam in the bays that received the mine's drainage, who ate fish from waters that were contaminated with arsenic from the roaster stacks. Some of them are aware of this now. Some of them have sought information about their exposure and found that the information is incomplete and that the reassurances they might hope for are not straightforwardly available. The question of how much harm was done to Yellowknife's general population by decades of arsenic emissions and water contamination is a question that has not been fully studied and has not been fully answered. The children who grew up in Old Town, the oldest neighborhood in Yellowknife, which sits close to the mine site, were at elevated risk for arsenic exposure through multiple pathways. The dust from the roaster stack settled on their neighborhood. The water they played in was contaminated. The soil in their yards, in some areas, contained elevated levels of arsenic from historical deposition. Studies done in the years after the mine closed found elevated arsenic levels in the soil of some residential areas near the mine. The government's response was to test the soil, to identify the most contaminated areas, and to remediate them, covering contaminated soil with clean fill, removing the most serious hotspots. Whether this remediation was comprehensive, whether there are children who were exposed to levels that will affect their health, in ways that have not yet manifested is not a question that can be answered with complete certainty. The Indigenous children of Yellowknife, who were disproportionately present in the neighborhoods closest to the mine site and who consumed traditional foods harvested from contaminated land and water, bear an additional layer of exposure and an additional layer of disadvantage in seeking acknowledgement and redress for the harm they experienced. The intersection of environmental contamination and Indigenous community health is one of the most poorly documented and least adequately addressed areas of Canadian public health history. There have been calls from researchers and from community members and from advocates for a comprehensive health study of the populations exposed to giant mines contamination over the decades of its operation. Such a study would attempt to track the health outcomes of former mine workers, of residents of contaminated neighborhoods, of members of the Yellowknives Dean community, to compare those outcomes against appropriate comparison populations, to look for the statistical signatures of elevated disease rates that would confirm or quantify the harm that existing evidence strongly suggests was done. Such a study has not been completed. The reasons for this are varied and contested. Studies of this kind are methodologically complex and expensive. The populations that would need to be studied are difficult to trace because people move and records are incomplete, and the health effects of arsenic exposure manifest over long time frames in ways that make attribution difficult. These are real obstacles. They are also, as community members and advocates have noted, obstacles that tend to be more formidable when the population whose health is at issue has limited political power. The absence of a comprehensive health study does not mean the harm did not happen. The scientific literature on the health effects of arsenic exposure is extensive and consistent. The patterns of disease in populations with known arsenic exposure have been documented in studies from around the world. The conditions at Giant Mine were sufficient to produce those patterns. The evidence that they did is suggestive in multiple, overlapping data sources, even without the comprehensive prospective study that would allow the most precise quantification. The workers were told their levels were acceptable. The residents were told the water was tested and was safe. The dean were told the remediation plan was the best available option and that their concerns were being taken seriously. These things were said by people in positions of authority and responsibility, and some of those people believed what they were saying, and some of them said it because it was what they were expected to say. The distinction matters less than it might seem, because the effect was the same. The people most at risk were given reassurances that kept them from fully understanding their situation or fully advocating for themselves. The Giant Mine story connects to a broader set of questions about how a society decides what to do with the byproducts of industrial production and who bears the cost of those decisions. These questions are not settled. They are live and urgent in a world that is still producing toxic waste in quantities that dwarf the arsenic at Giant Mine, still debating how to manage the nuclear waste from a global fleet of power plants, still grappling with the chemical contamination of waterways and soils and atmospheric commons that has accumulated over a century of industrial activity. The specific lessons of Giant Mine are not complicated. Cheap solutions to waste disposal problems are rarely actually cheap. They defer costs, accumulate them, and present them to future populations with interest. The cost of not protecting workers is not borne by the companies that fail to protect them. It is borne by the workers and their families. Regulatory systems that are designed to serve the interests of extractive industries rather than the interests of the communities those industries affect do not protect those communities. Indigenous communities whose land and resources are put at risk without their consent will bear those risks without receiving proportional benefit. None of these lessons requires specialized scientific or economic knowledge. They are visible in the historical record at Giant Mine and at dozens of other contaminated sites across Canada, and they are not obscure findings available only to specialists. They are the common content of the environmental and labor history of the country, documented in archives and academic publications, and the testimony of people who were there. The question of why these lessons have not been more consistently applied in the decades since they became available is a question about political economy and power. The industries that benefit from the ability to externalize the cost of their waste are powerful. They fund political campaigns and employ lobbyists and have access to the rooms where decisions are made in ways that contaminated communities and their advocates do not. The regulatory frameworks that govern industrial waste disposal are the product of negotiations that include those industries as principals and include the communities at risk primarily as interested parties to be consulted, rather than as parties with genuine power over outcomes. This is a structural problem, and structural problems require structural changes to resolve. The changes that would prevent future giant mines are known. They include genuine free, prior, and informed consent requirements for industrial development on Indigenous land. They include liability frameworks that require companies to fully bond the cost of cleanup before they begin operating, so that the option of walking away and leaving the public with the bill is not available. They include health monitoring requirements that document the impacts of industrial contamination on surrounding communities in real time rather than retrospectively. They include enforcement mechanisms with real teeth rather than the regulatory nudges that have historically characterized the Canadian approach to environmental compliance in the mining sector. Some of these changes have been made at the margins since the giant mine era. Environmental assessment processes in Canada are more rigorous than they were in the 1940s. Indigenous consultation requirements are more extensive. The legal landscape has shifted in ways that make the most egregious historical practices less straightforwardly available to modern operators. None of these changes is sufficient to guarantee that the next giant mine will not happen, because sufficiency would require a fundamentally different relationship between extractive industry and the regulatory state than currently exists. The arsenic is still in the ground. The monitoring continues. The freezing systems run. The debate about whether the remediation plan is adequate continues in the technical literature and in the community meetings and in the offices of the federal bureaucracy that manages the project. The Yellowknives. Dean continue to live on their traditional territory, downstream and downwind from 237,000 tons of poison that was put in the ground by decisions they did not make. The workers who breathe the dust are old, those who are still living. Some of them talk about what it was like. Some of them prefer not to. Some of them have been interviewed by journalists and researchers and have said in various ways that they were not told what they needed to know, that the reassurances they were given were not honest reassurances, that they went underground every day, trusting that the company and the government were managing their safety appropriately, and that the trust was not fully warranted. One former miner, interviewed by a researcher documenting the occupational history of Giant Mine, said something that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said that he knew, in the way that miners know things, that the dust was not good. He said that everyone knew. He said the knowing did not change anything because there was no place to put the knowledge that would make a difference. The union raised it. The company responded. The responses were written down in meeting minutes. The dust kept coming. That is the architecture of this kind of harm. Not a conspiracy of silence, but a system in which the information exists and is documented and is responded to, and the responses are sufficient to create a paper record of engagement, and the engagement does not stop the harm. The harm continues inside the architecture of the record. The record itself becomes part of the evidence of what was known and when and what was done about it. What was done about it, in the end, was that the company went bankrupt and the public picked up the tab, and the arsenic is frozen in the ground, and the monitoring continues, and no one has been held legally responsible for the harm that was done, and no one is likely to be. The freezing of the arsenic at Giant Mine is a technical solution to a problem that should never have been created, and it is worth spending time with the technical details because they illuminate something important about the nature of what has been left behind and the nature of the commitment that has been made. The arsenic trioxide in the underground chambers exists as a fine powder, particles in the range of a few microns in diameter coating the walls and floors of the cavities. Left by ore extraction, the chambers are distributed across a significant volume of the mine workings at various depths and connected by the drifts and crosscuts that make up the underground network of the mine. The total volume of underground space containing arsenic is large enough that any conventional approach to removing it, physically excavating the arsenic-coated rock, processing it somehow, disposing of it somewhere, would be, in the assessment of the engineers who study the options, prohibitively expensive and technically impractical. The frozen block approach works by maintaining the temperature of the rock surrounding and below the arsenic, containing chambers below 0 degrees Celsius, ensuring that any water in contact with the arsenic remains frozen and therefore cannot dissolve and transport the arsenic into the groundwater system. The thermosiphons are passive devices that work during winter months when the air above ground is colder than the ground, using the temperature difference to draw heat up and out of the earth. The active refrigeration system supplements this during summer months and during periods when passive cooling is insufficient. The design of the system accounts for the current climate of Yellowknife and for a degree of warming projected over the coming decades, but the honest answer to the question of how much warming the system can accommodate is that the answer depends on the specific warming trajectory, on how quickly the permafrost thaws, on how the hydrology of the site evolves, and on factors that cannot be predicted with high confidence over the timescales relevant to the containment commitment. There is something philosophically uncomfortable about the idea of making a permanent commitment on behalf of future generations to maintain an industrial waste containment system. The people who will be operating the giant mine monitoring systems in 100 years have not been born yet. They do not know they will have this responsibility. They have not consented to it. The decision that created the commitment was made by people who are alive today, managing a problem created by people who are dead, using money collected from people who were not alive when the problem was created, with the cost extending to people who have not yet been born. This is not unprecedented in human civilization. Nuclear waste repositories are designed around similar commitments. The management of other long-lived industrial contaminants involves similar long-horizon thinking. The intellectual and philosophical challenge of making decisions whose consequences extend beyond the lifespan of the decision makers is one that humans have grappled with in various contexts. The difficulty of the challenge does not make the commitment less real or less necessary. The arsenic is there and it needs to be managed. The frozen block approach is the best option that has been identified. The commitment has been made, but acknowledging the commitment and acknowledging its difficulty and its origins is important because it affects how we should think about the decisions that created this situation and the decisions that will create analogous situations in the future. A society that is honest about what it is committing its descendants to when it allows industrial operations to create permanent waste problems will make different decisions about allowing those operations than a society that treats the waste problem as a future problem to be addressed by future people with future technology. Future technology has not, in the case of arsenic, provided an escape. The arsenic is still arsenic, and it is still underground, and the best available technology is still a refrigeration system. The hope that technology will solve the problem is not baseless, but it is not yet founded on anything more concrete than hope. And hope is not a remediation plan. The broader public awareness of giant mine in Canada is even now relatively limited. This is partly a function of geography. Yellowknife is far from the major population centers of Canada. The Northwest Territories has a small population and minimal political weight relative to the provinces. The stories that circulate in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal about what Canada is and what it has done and what it owes tend not to prominently feature the subarctic. The Indigenous communities of the North are too often invisible in the national conversation until something dramatic enough to break through the geographic and cultural distance makes them briefly visible. The 9 men who died in the 1992 explosion got national attention. The explosion was dramatic, sudden, prosecutable. It had a villain who was caught and convicted. It had a clear narrative shape. The slow death of the men who breathed arsenic dust. Over decades of work, the contamination of Indigenous food systems, the permanent entombment of 237,000 tons of poison in the ground beneath a city, these things have not, despite being more significant in terms of the total harm caused, achieved the same level of national attention. They are the kind of harm that requires sustained attention and willingness to reckon with systemic failure, and sustained attention to systemic failure is not what national media tends to provide. The Giant Mine Remediation Project has its own website, and the website is reasonably informative, and there is an Indigenous community monitoring program that involves members of the Yellowknives Dean First Nation in the monitoring activities at the site, giving the community some presence in the ongoing management of the problem that their traditional territory has become. These are real improvements over the historical situation and real acknowledgments of the community's stake in the remediation. They are not restitution for the harm done, partly because it is not clear what adequate restitution for this kind of long-term environmental and health damage would even look like. There is a historical display at the Giant Mine site, and there are efforts to document and preserve the memory of what happened there, the gold rush, the labor history, the contamination, the remediation. Memory is important. It is part of how societies avoid repeating their mistakes when they manage to avoid repeating them. The memory of Giant Mine is preserved in the archives and in the academic literature and in the testimony of the people who lived it, and it is available to anyone who goes looking for it. The problem is that most people do not go looking for it because most people do not know it exists, because the story of Giant Mine has not been told loudly enough or frequently enough in the context where it might influence the decisions that will determine whether the next giant mine gets built. This is a media problem and a political problem and an education problem and a cultural problem, and it is unlikely to be solved by any single telling of the story, including this one. But every telling matters. Every time someone hears this story and understands it and carries it forward, the probability that it will reach the person who needs to hear it at the moment when it might matter increases slightly. The accumulation of those slight increases over time is how the public knowledge that makes democratic accountability possible actually works. Giant Mine happened because not enough people knew in time what was happening. The decisions that created it were made in a context of limited public accountability, limited regulatory oversight, and limited political power for the communities most affected. Changing that context, making these decisions more visible and more accountable, is the only reliable way to prevent the next iteration of this story. The arsenic in the ground at Giant Mine will be there for a very long time. The commitment to manage it will outlive everyone reading this. The decisions that put it there were made by people who are gone. The decisions that will determine whether analogous situations are created in the future are being made now by people who are alive, in companies and government offices and regulatory agencies, in response to pressures that include, when enough people insist on it, the pressure of an informed public that understands what is at stake. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing. The final question that this story asks is not a technical question about refrigeration systems, or a legal question about liability, or a political question about regulatory reform. It is a question about memory and obligation. What do we owe to the people who were harmed by decisions made before most of us were born? And what do we owe to the people who will inherit the consequences of decisions being made now? The workers who breathed arsenic dust at Giant Mine are owed something. The Yellowknives, Dean, who ate contaminated food and lost community members to cancers connected to the mine's emissions, are owed something. The residents of Yellowknife who live with a permanent arsenic liability under their city are owed something. What they are owed is not perfectly clear, and the mechanisms for providing it are imperfect and contested and politically difficult. But the existence of the debt is not in doubt. The people who will be managing the frozen block in 2100, whoever they are, wherever they work, whatever the world looks like by then, are owed something too. They are owed the honest accounting of how this situation came to be, so that they understand it fully. They are owed the institutional memory and the technical documentation and the continued funding that will allow them to manage the containment competently. They are owed, if it is possible to provide it, a reduction in the burden they carry through whatever technical innovation or remediation effort might become available in the intervening decades, and the communities that will be asked in the years and decades to come to host new mines and new industrial operations and new sources of long-lived waste are owed the full story of what happened at Giant Mine, so that they can make genuinely informed decisions about what they are agreeing to and what they are not. That is what this story is. It is the full account, or as full an account as can be assembled from what is publicly available, of what happened at Giant Mine. It is the story of 237,000 tons of poison in the ground, and the people who put it there, and the people who were harmed by it, and the people who are trying to manage it, and the people who will be managing it, long after everyone currently alive is gone. It is a Canadian story. It is a story about the North, and about gold, and about arsenic, and about power, and about who bears the cost of the choices that are made in the pursuit of wealth. It is not a comfortable story. It does not have a resolution. The arsenic is still there, and the freezing systems are running, and the monitoring continues, and the debt to the people who were harmed has not been paid, and the lessons that should have been learned from it are still being learned. Imperfectly, slowly, in a world that keeps building mines. If you have made it this far, you are the kind of person who cares about this kind of history, who wants to understand not just what happened, but why and what it means. This channel exists to tell that kind of story every week about places and events and decisions that shape the world we live in without making it into the history books that most of us grew up reading. If that is what you are looking for, subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and leave a comment telling me what part of this story hit you hardest. I read every comment. I want to know what landed. The mine is sealed. The workers were told to forget, but we can remember for them. That is what this is for. The year 1992 is worth returning to, because the explosion that killed 9 men was not the beginning of the violence at Giant Mine. It was the most visible moment in a long history of harm. The labor dispute that preceded the explosion had been building for years, shaped by exactly the tensions that have run through this entire account. The tension between the workers who understood that their health and safety were being treated as acceptable losses, and the management that insisted the situation was being handled appropriately. The strike began in May of 1992. The Canadian Association of Smelter and Allied Workers had been in negotiations with Royal Oak Mines, the company then operating Giant Mine, and the negotiations had broken down. Royal Oak, under the leadership of its chief executive Margaret Witt, took an approach to the labor dispute that was aggressive in ways that the Yellowknife community would eventually pay for. Replacement workers were brought in. The mine continued operating. The striking workers, watching their jobs filled by people bussed in from other provinces, were not in a mood to be patient. The months between May and September of 1992 were months of escalating tension, of incidents at the picket line, of police involvement, of community divisions that ran through families and friendships in a town where the mine was the center of the economy, and the economy was the center of everything else. The province had essentially become 2 camps, and the hostility between them was real and sometimes physical. On the night of September 18th, Roger Warren, a striking miner with more than 20 years of experience at Giant Mine, went underground through an emergency exit and planted a pipe bomb on a rail line used by the underground work crews. He had planned the bomb to derail a man car, the vehicle that transported workers through the mine. The bomb detonated as planned. The 9 replacement workers traveling in the man car were killed. It was the deadliest act of industrial sabotage in Canadian history. Warren was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced. He was released on parole decades later. The 9 men who died are remembered at a memorial. The community that the strike and the explosion shattered has never fully healed. In Yellowknife, you can still find people who remember exactly where they were when they heard. It is that kind of event in that kind of town. What the explosion obscured by its sheer dramatic weight was everything that had been happening before it and everything that continued happening after it. The arsenic in the ground, the health of the workers who had spent decades breathing dust, the contamination of the surrounding land and water. These things did not stop being real because 9 men died in a tunnel, but they became harder to see because the explosion was the kind of event that defines a place in memory, that becomes the thing the place is known for, and everything else, including the quieter and more systemic harms, gets organized in relation to it. The families of the 9 men killed in the explosion deserve their grief and their memorial. The history of labor violence in Canada deserves the serious examination it has received in the years since the event. And the history of the arsenic, of the workers who were slowly harmed by their exposure to it, of the Dean community whose food system was contaminated, of the decision makers who chose profit over safety, decade after decade, deserves equal examination and has received less of it. Roger Warren acted out of specific rage at a specific situation in a specific moment. The people who made the decisions that produced the arsenic problem, that kept workers in the dark about their health risks, that failed to remediate the contamination of Indigenous food systems, acted out of systemic incentives. Over decades, their actions caused more total harm than Warren's. They have faced less accountability than Warren did. The disproportion is not accidental. The science of arsenic toxicity is worth examining in some detail, because understanding what arsenic does to the human body clarifies why the health outcomes of the workers and community members exposed to giant mines contamination are what they are, and why the reassurances that were given over the years were, in the best light, inadequate, and in a less charitable light, dishonest. Arsenic is a metalloid, a substance with properties intermediate between metals and nonmetals. It is element 33 on the periodic table, and it occurs naturally in the Earth's crust, concentrated in mineral deposits like arsenoporite. In its trivalent form, the form most associated with the arsenic trioxide produced at Giant Mine, it is acutely toxic at low doses and chronically toxic at doses that would not produce immediate symptoms. The mechanism of arsenic toxicity involves the disruption of cellular energy production. Arsenic interferes with enzymes involved in the citric acid cycle, the fundamental process by which cells generate the energy they need to function. In acute arsenic poisoning, the disruption of cellular energy production is rapid and severe enough to be fatal. In chronic arsenic poisoning, the disruption is subtler and cumulative, producing damage across multiple organ systems over years and decades. The organs most affected by chronic arsenic exposure include the lungs, the liver, the kidneys, the bladder, and the nervous system. Cancer risk is elevated across several tumor types, most prominently lung cancer, bladder cancer, and skin cancer. The skin cancer associated with arsenic exposure has a characteristic presentation. Hyperkeratosis, a thickening and roughening of the skin, often concentrated on the palms and soles, and hyperpigmentation, an irregular darkening of the skin in patches. These skin changes are diagnostically significant because they are distinctive and because the skin, unlike the lungs or the bladder, is directly observable. Workers at Giant Mine who developed characteristic arsenic-related skin changes had visible evidence on their bodies of their exposure. This evidence was observed by company doctors and occupational health personnel over the decades of the mine's operation. The records of these observations exist. What followed from the observations, in terms of systematic effort to reduce exposure or to provide the affected workers with full and accurate information about the health implications of what was happening to their skin, was not proportionate to the significance of what was being observed. The neurological effects of chronic arsenic exposure include peripheral neuropathy, a condition in which the nerves of the extremities are damaged, producing numbness, tingling, pain, and eventually weakness in the hands and feet. More severe neurological involvement can include encephalopathy, a diffuse impairment of brain function that manifests as cognitive difficulties, personality changes, and in severe cases, psychiatric symptoms. The neurological effects of arsenic exposure can be difficult to distinguish from other causes of similar symptoms, which creates ambiguity that can be exploited to avoid attributing them to occupational exposure. This ambiguity has a history. When workers at Giant Mine and at similar industrial facilities raised concerns about neurological symptoms, about memory problems, about tremors, about the feeling of not being themselves, the response from company medical personnel frequently invoked that ambiguity. The symptoms could have other causes. The arsenic levels were within acceptable limits. More study was needed before any conclusions could be drawn. This pattern of invoking ambiguity to avoid action is documented in the occupational health literature as a standard technique of what researchers call the manufacture of doubt, the strategic deployment of scientific uncertainty to delay regulatory or legal action. The manufacture of doubt around the health effects of toxic exposures has a well-documented history in the tobacco industry, in the asbestos industry, in the lead industry, and in the chemical industry more broadly. It is not unique to mining. It is a consistent response to a consistent incentive. The financial cost of acknowledging harm and reducing exposure is immediate and certain, while the legal and reputational cost of denial is uncertain and may be long delayed. Companies facing this incentive structure repeatedly choose to manufacture doubt, even when the underlying science is clear. The underlying science in the case of arsenic was clear. Arsenic was a recognized carcinogen. The routes of exposure, inhalation, ingestion, and skin contact were understood. The dose-response relationships, the relationship between the amount of arsenic a person is exposed to and the magnitude of the health risk they face, had been studied in exposed populations around the world. The workers at Giant Mine were being exposed to arsenic through multiple routes at levels that the science predicted would produce elevated rates of specific cancers and neurological damage. The predictions were correct. The elevated rates materialized. None of this is in serious scientific dispute. The specific attribution of specific cancers in specific individuals to their exposure at Giant Mine remains legally contested in some cases, because legal causation standards require a level of certainty that epidemiological evidence often cannot provide for individual cases. But the population-level harm is documented and undisputed among the researchers who have studied it. What makes the Giant Mine story resonate beyond its specific geography is the way it illustrates a failure mode that repeats itself across the history of industrial civilization. The failure mode has recognizable features. An extractive industry identifies a resource. The resource is valuable. The extraction process produces a byproduct that is hazardous. The hazard is recognized by someone, somewhere, early in the process. The recognition is met not with a change in the extraction process, but with a determination that the hazard is manageable at acceptable cost. The management plan involves some combination of dispersal, storage, and reassurance. The dispersal and storage create long-term liabilities that the management plan does not fully account for. The reassurances keep the people most affected from fully understanding their situation. The extraction continues. The liabilities accumulate. Eventually, the industry moves on, leaving the liabilities behind. This sequence has played out with coal and coal ash. It has played out with petroleum and its various carcinogenic byproducts. It has played out with heavy metals across the history of mining and smelting. It has played out with synthetic chemicals from the pesticide and plastics industries. It has played out with radioactive materials from the nuclear fuel cycle. In each case, the specific substance and the specific location are different. The underlying structure of the failure, the privatization of benefit and the socialization of cost, the sacrifice of vulnerable communities, the manufacture of doubt, the eventual acknowledgement of harm without adequate accountability is remarkably consistent. Understanding this failure mode as a pattern rather than as a series of isolated incidents changes how you think about the regulatory frameworks designed to prevent it. A framework designed to prevent an isolated incident is necessarily focused on the specific features of that incident, the particular chemical, the particular pathway of exposure, the particular community affected. A framework designed to prevent a systemic failure mode must address the incentive structures that produce the pattern, regardless of the specific substance or location. The incentive structures that produce Giant Mine are still largely in place. Mining companies in Canada can still externalize environmental costs that their operations create, to a greater or lesser degree depending on the specific regulatory context. Indigenous communities still face structural barriers to genuine, not merely formal, consultation about industrial development on their traditional territories. Workers in extractive industries still face information asymmetries about the health risks of their work and still face implicit incentives not to raise concerns that might threaten their employment. Regulatory agencies still operate with limited resources and under political pressure from the industries they regulate. These structural features of the regulatory environment have been improved at the margins since the giant mine era. Environmental bonds required of new mining operations are higher. Indigenous consultation requirements have been strengthened by court decisions interpreting the duty to consult. Occupational health regulations have been updated in response to evidence. The improvements are real. They are not transformative. Giant mine is an extreme example, a case in which the combination of the toxic byproduct, the scale of the operation, the duration of the exposure, and the vulnerability of the communities affected produced outcomes more severe than most. But the structure of the harm is ordinary. It is the ordinary structure of how extractive industries have related to the communities and environments they operate in for as long as industrial extraction has existed. The extraordinariness of giant mine is a matter of degree, not of kind. The conversation about how to change this structure is ongoing in Canada and in every country with a significant extractive sector. It involves questions about who has the right to say no to industrial development, what financial assurances companies should be required to provide before they are allowed to begin operations, how the health impacts of industrial activity should be monitored and compensated for, and who should bear the cost when a company concludes that its waste problem is someone else's responsibility. These questions have known answers, in the sense that reasonable policy frameworks exist that would address them more effectively than current arrangements. The barrier to implementing those frameworks is not technical or intellectual. It is political, in the sense that the interests benefiting from the current arrangements have more influence over the political process than the interests that would benefit from changing them. Changing that balance of influence is a democratic project, and it requires exactly the kind of informed public engagement that is possible only when people know what has happened and why, and what the alternatives are. That is why this kind of history matters, not as a way of assigning blame to people who are dead, but as a way of understanding the present and expanding the range of futures that are available to us. The permafrost under giant mine is not the only permafrost that is thawing. Across the subarctic and Arctic regions of Canada and Russia and Alaska and Scandinavia, permafrost that has been frozen for thousands of years is beginning to thaw as the climate warms at an accelerating rate. This thawing has consequences that extend far beyond the specific case of giant mine, but the giant mine case illustrates one of those consequences with unusual clarity. When you have relied on permafrost to help manage an industrial waste problem and the permafrost begins to thaw, you have a problem. The permafrost across the Northwest Territories is thawing at rates that are measurable and documented. Roads are subsiding, buildings are shifting on their foundations. Ecosystems are changing as the frozen ground releases carbon that has been locked in it since before the Holocene. The scale of the changes is significant enough to be visible from space in satellite imagery showing the expansion of thermokarst lakes that form as frozen ground thaws and subsides. In this context, the choice to rely on a combination of natural permafrost and active refrigeration to manage the giant mine arsenic problem is a choice that is subject to ongoing stress from climate change. The engineers who designed the frozen block containment system were aware of this and designed accordingly, with a degree of climate projection built into the system's specifications. The projection built in may or may not be sufficient, depending on how quickly the climate changes and along what specific trajectory. The honest assessment of the situation from the technical literature is that the system is currently functioning as designed, and that the projections used in the design were reasonable given the information available when the design was made, and that the situation will need to be monitored and potentially adapted as climate conditions evolve. This is a responsible and technically sound assessment. It does not provide the certainty that a permanent commitment ideally requires. The people of Yellowknife live with this uncertainty, as they live with many uncertainties associated with a subarctic city in a rapidly changing climate. They monitor the situation through the information the remediation project provides, through the results of the ongoing water quality testing, through the conversations that happen in the community about the mine and its legacy. They have, as a community, been living with Giant Mine's presence for the better part of a century. The relationship is complex, and the feelings it produces are varied. Some residents of Yellowknife are angry about the arsenic problem and its origins. Some are largely unaware of the details of the history. Some have a fatalistic relationship to it, a sense that the situation is what it is, and the management is ongoing, and there is not much that individual awareness changes about the practical daily reality. Some, especially in the Yellowknives DNA community, carry the weight of it as part of a longer history of dispossession and harm that the mine is one chapter of, rather than the whole story. The diversity of relationships to the Giant Mine legacy within Yellowknife is itself informative. When a community has been living with an industrial contamination problem for 80 years, the relationship to that problem is not simple or uniform. It has been shaped by who you are and where you live and what you know and what you lost and what you were told and what you figured out for yourself. It is a relationship between a community and its own complicated history, and it is not resolved by any single telling of the story. The final entry in the ledger of Giant Mine is the question of what happened to the land itself, the physical landscape of the mine site, and what it will look like in the decades and centuries ahead. The surface footprint of Giant Mine is large. The mine and its associated infrastructure occupied several hundred hectares of land along the northern shore of Yellowknife Bay. The surface expression of decades of mining activity includes the head frames and shaft collars of the mine shafts themselves, the processing facilities and roaster buildings, the tailings areas where processed ore was deposited, the roads and parking areas and administrative buildings of an industrial facility that was in operation for nearly 60 years. The remediation project is systematically addressing the surface. Buildings that are no longer needed are being demolished and the material sorted for recycling or disposal. The most contaminated soils are being excavated and consolidated in engineered containment facilities. The tailings areas are being covered with engineered caps designed to reduce the infiltration of rainwater and to prevent the blowing of contaminated dust. The overall shape of the site is being transformed from the industrial landscape of an active mine to something that looks, on the surface at least, more like the surrounding terrain. What cannot be transformed is what is underground. The shafts and drifts and crosscuts of the mine, the cavities left by ore extraction, the chambers filled with arsenic trioxide, these features of the underground landscape are permanent on any human timescale. The arsenic containing chambers will be sealed and frozen and monitored, but they will not be removed. The arsenic will not leave the ground. The underground geography of Giant Mine, the particular shape of human intervention in that ancient rock, will persist for as long as the rock persists, which is to say, effectively forever. This permanence is part of what makes Giant Mine unusual as a case study in industrial legacy. Most industrial sites, even heavily contaminated ones, can in principle be remediated to a condition that does not require permanent active management. The contaminants can be removed or neutralized. The site can return to something that resembles its pre-industrial state, at least in terms of the absence of immediate hazard. Giant mine cannot do this. The quantity of arsenic underground, combined with its chemical stability and the absence of any practical method of removing or neutralizing it in place, means that the commitment is truly permanent. The site will require management in perpetuity. That is not a figure of speech. What that permanence means for the Yellowknives Dean, whose traditional relationship to this land extends back thousands of years, and whose relationship to its future is a matter of cultural and spiritual as well as practical significance, is a question that the Remediation Project engages with through its consultation structures but cannot answer definitively. The land on which Giant Mine stands is Yellowknives Dean land, in the sense that it has been the Dean's territory since before any European arrived in the region. What it means for a piece of your traditional territory to be permanently altered, permanently committed to industrial waste management, permanently inaccessible for the traditional uses that have defined your relationship to the land, is something that cannot be measured in economic terms and does not fit comfortably into the language of environmental assessment and remediation planning. The Yellowknives Dean have not given up on their relationship to the land. The Remediation Project includes provisions for the ongoing involvement of Dean knowledge holders in the monitoring of the site and the surrounding land and water. The community continues to hunt and fish in the region with the awareness that contamination has occurred and with monitoring to track its current extent and movement. The relationship is altered and burdened, but it continues. The ground remembers everything that has been put into it. 2.5 billion-year-old rock, carved by the slowness of geological time, now holds within it the product of 60 years of human industry. The arsenic trioxide in those underground chambers will be there long after the English language has changed beyond recognition, long after the governmental institutions that currently manage the remediation project have ceased to exist in their current forms, long after every person alive today has died and been forgotten. That is the true scale of what Giant Mine represents, not a Canadian problem or a northern problem or a mining industry problem. A permanent alteration of the physical world made in the span of a single human lifetime that will persist on geological timescales. The gold that was extracted from that rock is dispersed across the global economy, in jewelry and electronics and financial reserves, bearing no mark of where it came from or what was left behind. The arsenic is in the ground. The ground holds it. The rock does not forget. When we talk about what we owe to the future, this is part of what we are talking about. The decisions made at Giant Mine, the decision to keep roasting ore and storing arsenic, even when the scale of the accumulation was becoming clear, the decision to continue mining when the financial and technical means to address the waste problem were not in place, the decision to allow a company to walk away from a permanent liability and leave it with the public. These decisions were made by people who did not think hard enough about what they were committing the future to. Or perhaps they thought about it and decided that the future was not their problem. It is, however, all of our problem now. That is what Giant Mine teaches us, most fundamentally and most importantly. The future arrives. It always arrives. And when it arrives, the things we put in the ground are still in the ground. Remember that. And subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. There is more of this history that needs to be told. There are people who will read what has been written here and conclude that the story of Giant Mine is, at its core, a story about a different era. An era before environmental assessment, before Indigenous consultation requirements, before the regulatory frameworks and the liability rules and the occupational health standards that have since been put in place. They will conclude that the conditions that made Giant Mine possible have been sufficiently changed that something comparable cannot happen today, and that the appropriate response to this history is to acknowledge it as a past failure while maintaining confidence in the improvements that have been made since. This conclusion is not available to anyone who has seriously studied the current state of resource extraction in Canada. The improvements that have been made are real. They are also incomplete, contested, inconsistently enforced, and subject to ongoing rollback when the political winds shift in favor of reducing the regulatory burden on industry. The pipeline of new industrial projects that are currently being proposed, reviewed, approved, and built in the Canadian North contains projects that will create long-lived waste problems of their own, problems that future governments will be asked to manage in perpetuity with the same combination of technical ingenuity and public money that is currently being spent at Giant Mine. The oil sands of northern Alberta are the most obvious example. The tailings ponds associated with oil sands extraction contain billions of liters of contaminated water and sludge held behind earthen dams in a region of sensitive boreal ecosystem and Indigenous territory. The volume of contaminated material in the oil sands tailings ponds is orders of magnitude larger than the arsenic stored at Giant Mine. The technology for remediating those ponds, for returning the land to a condition that does not require permanent active management, does not currently exist at scale. The industry's own projections for how long remediation will take and how much it will cost are widely regarded by independent analysts as optimistic to the point of implausibility. This is not a digression from the Giant Mine story. It is the Giant Mine story, retold at a larger scale, in a different decade, with different corporations and different communities and different specific contaminants, but the same fundamental structure. Extraction for private profit, waste deferred to the public and to the future, communities without adequate political power to say no, bearing the greatest risk, reassurances given that the situation is being managed appropriately. The people who are saying that now about the oil sands tailings ponds are the same kind of people who said it about the arsenic at Giant Mine. They are engineers and scientists, and many of them are doing their best with genuinely difficult technical problems. They are also embedded in an institutional structure that rewards confidence over candor, that responds to questions about long-term liability with projections of technical optimism, that has financial and reputational incentives to frame the situation as manageable in ways that may not fully reflect the actual state of the science. 70 years from now, if the pattern holds, someone will be telling the story of the oil sands tailings ponds the way this story has been told. The ponds will have been inherited by the public. The companies that created them will be gone or transformed beyond recognition. The communities most affected will be asking for accountability that is not forthcoming. The technology that was promised to solve the problem will have arrived in partial and insufficient forms. And the question of what we owe to the people and the land that bore the cost of the extraction will be as unresolved as it is at Giant Mine today. The way to avoid that future is not to wait for it and then tell the story afterward. The way to avoid it is to insist now, with the information available now, that the decisions being made about current industrial development in Canada be held to a genuinely different standard than the decisions that produced Giant Mine, a standard that requires companies to demonstrate before they begin that their waste management plans are adequate for the full life cycle of their waste, a standard that gives Indigenous communities genuine power to say no to development on their traditional territories, not just the right to be consulted and overruled, a standard that requires health monitoring of affected communities in real time, not retrospective studies done decades after the harm, a standard that holds executives and directors personally accountable when regulatory violations produce harm, not just the corporate entity that can be restructured to avoid liability. These standards are achievable. Countries have implemented versions of them. Canada has implemented pieces of them, incompletely. The gap between what has been implemented and what is needed is the gap between the historical record of giant mine and the future that is still being written. The workers deserve a final word, not as a collective or a category or a case study in occupational health, but as the specific human beings they were, men who came to Yellowknife from everywhere, who went underground in the cold and the dark, who breathed the air that was down there with them, who did the work that the company needed done, and who were not given the full truth about what that work was costing them. Their names are in the records, in the union rosters and the payroll ledgers and the occupational health files, many of them. Some of their names have been shared by researchers. Some of them have told their own stories in interviews and testimony. They are not anonymous in the way that victims of historical industrial harm often become anonymous, rendered into statistics and categories in case files. A miner named Tony told a researcher that the dust in the roaster building was so thick on some shifts that you could write your name in it on the equipment. He said the company had masks for them, but the masks were uncomfortable, and they fogged up, and the supervisors did not always insist on them, and the culture on the floor was not to complain about the discomfort, because complaining was not something that was done. He said he developed a cough in his second year that he has had ever since. He is in his 80s now. The cough is still there. A miner named Frank said that the company doctor told him his skin condition was eczema. He said this for years. He did not connect it to the arsenic until he read something about it much later, after he had retired, after years of working with the dust. He said when he understood what the skin condition actually was and what it meant about his exposure, he felt something that he did not immediately have a word for. He eventually said it was like finding out you had been lied to by someone you had no choice but to trust. A miner named Bill said that when he raised the arsenic question at a union meeting, one of the company representatives said that the levels were being monitored and were within regulations, and that if the regulations said it was safe, then it was safe. He said he thought about that for a long time. He said he eventually concluded that the man who said it believed it, that the belief was the problem more than the lie, that a man who genuinely believed the regulations guaranteed safety had been given a faith that was not warranted by the evidence. He said that was harder to be angry about than a deliberate lie. But he managed. These men, and the men whose names are not in the interviews and the testimonies, who went home to their families with the dust on them and the cough developing and the symptoms that were not being named as what they were, are the human face of the numbers in this story. 237,000 tons of arsenic, $1 billion of remediation costs, elevated rates of cancer in an exposed population. Each of those numbers represents a life that was lived in proximity to a danger that was known and not shared. Each represents a family that was not given the information it needed. Each represents a calculation made somewhere by someone that the cost of full disclosure was more than the cost of the silence. The cost of the silence was paid by the workers. They paid it in their health and in their years, and in the particular quality of trust that is destroyed when you discover, late in the game, that the people you relied on to tell you the truth were not telling you everything. That cost is real, and it is not recoverable. The men who bore it deserve to be seen by whoever is listening to this story, not as abstractions, but as what they were. People with specific bodies and specific families and specific histories who went to work and were not protected as they should have been. That is the most important thing this story contains. Not the technical details of the frozen block containment system or the regulatory history of Canadian mining law or the epidemiology of arsenic-related cancer. Those things matter, and they have been laid out here as accurately as the available information allows. But the most important thing is the human dimension, the specific people who were harmed, the specific choices that were made not to protect them, the specific gap between what was known and what was shared. That gap is what accountability is for. Accountability for that gap, when it is meaningful, changes the calculus that companies make about what to disclose and what to hold back. It changes the incentives that produce the manufacture of doubt. It changes the culture in which a supervisor looks the other way while workers skip their masks because complaining is not done. Accountability is hard to achieve and imperfect when it arrives, but its absence is not neutral. Its absence is a policy, it is a choice, and the effects of that choice are visible at Giant Mine, in the health records and the community testimony, and the 237,000 tons of poison in the ground. The mine is sealed. The workers were told their levels were acceptable. The community was told the water was being tested. The dean were told their concerns were being taken seriously. The arsenic is still in the ground. We can know this now, and knowing it, we can insist that it does not happen in exactly this way again. That is the minimum that the people who paid the cost of this story are owed by the people who are hearing it. Pay it forward. Subscribe. Share this if it reached you. The history that gets told widely enough eventually becomes the history that informs decisions. That is why this matters. That is why you are here. And that is why this channel will keep going, week after week, into the places and the stories that most accounts of history leave out. The ground remembers, so should we. The documentation of what happened at Giant Mine sits in archives across Canada, in federal records held by Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, in the collections of the Northwest Territories Archives in Yellowknife, in the records of the territorial government, in the union files that were preserved when the Canadian Association of Smelter and Allied Workers dissolved, in the collections of universities that have studied the mine's history, in the private papers of people who worked there and their families. The volume of documentation is substantial. The number of people who have read it is small. This is one of the paradoxes of historical accountability in the modern era. The information that would make accountability possible exists and is, in principle, accessible. The challenge is not secrecy in the traditional sense, the deliberate concealment of records in locked vaults by people who fear exposure. The challenge is the combination of volume and obscurity, the fact that the relevant information is distributed across thousands of documents in multiple archives, requiring time and expertise and sustained attention to assemble into a coherent picture. The work of assembling that picture has been done by researchers and journalists and advocates who have put in the time. But the picture assembled by that work has not reached most of the people who might be affected by it or might be in a position to act on it. This gap between the existence of information and its effective circulation in the public is a general problem of knowledge in a complex society, and it does not have a simple solution. But it is also a gap that is closed, incrementally, by the specific act of telling stories. Not academic papers, which are read by specialists, not archival collections, which are accessed by researchers. Stories of the kind that can be told to a general audience and that can travel through the channels of communication available in a given moment, reaching people who did not set out to learn this history, but who encounter it and find that it matters to them. This is one of those stories. It has tried to be accurate, to reflect what is documented in the public record about Giant Mine, about the arsenic, about the workers, about the Yellowknives dean, about the regulatory and corporate decisions that produce the situation that exists today. Where it has simplified, the simplification has been in the service of accessibility rather than distortion. The underlying reality is more complex than any telling of it can fully capture, and the people who want the full complexity have access to the sources. What this telling has tried to do is make the basic outlines of the story available to people who encounter it without prior knowledge, who might not have sought it out if it had not come to them in this form, and who might, having heard it, carry some part of it forward into conversations and decisions, and eventually into the political context in which the decisions that will determine whether the next giant mine happens are made. That is not a grandiose hope. It is a modest and realistic one. Stories travel. They attach to the people who hear them. They come up in unexpected contexts. A person who hears the giant mine story and finds it significant will at some point mention it to someone else, and that person will mention it to someone else, and in one of those subsequent conversations, it will reach someone who is positioned to make a decision that the story might influence. That is how public knowledge, the kind of distributed awareness that shapes democratic outcomes, actually grows and propagates. It is a slow and uncertain process. It is also the process by which every significant shift in public understanding has ever actually happened. The history of successful advocacy for environmental protection, for worker safety, for Indigenous land rights, is a history of stories that traveled until they reached the people who needed to hear them. Giant Mine should be one of those stories. It has not yet fully become one. That is what this telling is for. There is one more dimension of the Giant Mine story that deserves attention before this account closes, and it is the dimension of time, specifically the relationship between the human experience of time and the timescales that are relevant to industrial contamination. Human beings are not well equipped to reason about very long timescales. Our intuitions are calibrated to the lengths of individual lives, of family histories, of generational memory that extends perhaps 3 or 4 generations before it becomes abstract. We can understand intellectually that something will persist for 1,000 years, but we cannot feel that duration the way we feel the duration of a day or a year or a lifetime. The emotional and moral weight we assign to consequences tends to diminish with time horizon in a way that is well documented in cognitive science, and that has significant implications for how we make decisions about long-lived consequences. The people who made decisions at Giant Mine over the decades of its operation were not, for the most part, sociopaths who did not care about the future. They were people whose intuitions about time, like all human intuitions about time, were poorly calibrated for the timescales relevant to the arsenic problem they were creating. A decision to store arsenic underground in 1955 felt, to the person making it, like a practical management choice for a present problem. The implication of that decision for 2055 or 2155 or 3055 was not viscerally present to them in the way that the immediate problem was. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and the distinction matters because an explanation points toward a solution in a way that an accusation of moral failure does not. The solution is institutional. If individual human psychology is poorly calibrated for very long-term consequences, then the institutions that mediate between individual decisions and their long-term effects must be designed to compensate for that limitation. Environmental assessment processes that require genuine accounting for long-term liabilities, not the optimistic projections that the regulatory process historically accepted. Financial bonding requirements that actually reflect the full cost of long-term remediation, so that the cost is real and present to the decision makers, not deferred to the future. Legal frameworks that create ongoing liability for corporate decisions that produce long-term harm, so that the option of declaring bankruptcy and walking away is not available. These institutional fixes are known. They are not implemented adequately. The gap between knowing what institutional changes would prevent the next giant mine and implementing those changes is the gap that political will, informed by public awareness, must close. The arsenic at Giant Mine will be in the ground for longer than any of us can imagine. The decision to put it there was made by people who have been dead for decades. The management of it will be the responsibility of people who are not yet born. In between those points in time, there is the present moment in which people who are alive know what happened and know what is needed to prevent it from happening again, and have the capacity, if they choose to exercise it, to demand the institutional changes that would make the prevention real. That capacity is the final thing this story wants to leave with whoever is listening. Not despair at the scale of the harm that has been done. Not cynicism about the institutions that allowed it to happen. The capacity that comes from knowledge, from understanding how this failure happened, and therefore being able to see it coming in the future, from knowing what the alternatives are and being able to name them when they are not being chosen. Giant Mine sealed its chambers. The workers were told the levels were acceptable. The arsenic went in the ground, and it is still there. What we do with the knowledge of that right now, in the time we actually have, is still ours to decide. Thank you for being here. If you want to keep going deeper into the histories that shape the world we live in without appearing in the history books most of us read, subscribe to this channel. Every week, another story. Like this one. Another place, another decision, another set of people who paid a cost that should have been shared more fairly. This work matters because the past is not past. It is in the ground. It is in the water. It is in the bodies of people who are still alive. Understanding it is the first step to changing it. Subscribe, share this, and leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you. Tell me where you are in the world. The community that shows up in these comments is the community that makes this work possible and worthwhile. See you in the next one.